Welcome, welcome again. My name is Colleen Curlin. I lead the programming for the Battery, both on property and online. I'm so excited to be here tonight to kick off Sparked. Sparked is the Battery signature conference where we explore what connects us to ourselves and each other. We encourage you to take this opportunity to look ahead and think about what it means to build a better future for generations ahead. Sparked usually takes place at the Battery over one amazing day. Since we're not able to gather in person this year, we have an incredible 2 weeks of programming ahead, including more talks, workshops, and wellness events. All of these events are free with a suggested donation of $10, with all the proceeds benefiting Battery Powered and their current giving theme, Climate Action. If you're interested in joining more events, you can see the full schedule on thebatteryspark.com. I'll drop a link in the chat. Thanks for joining our first event, The Power of Ethics, How We Make Good Decisions in a Complicated World. Our modern world bombards us daily with ethical challenges that are blurring with the best outcomes usually found in the gray areas. New technologies, ideas, and institutions are creating ethically complex landscapes, and most people and companies lack the tools to effectively evaluate tough issues. It's my pleasure to welcome Susan Liautaud, author of The Power of Ethics. Susan teaches cutting-edge ethics courses at Stanford University, serves as chair of council for the London School of Economics and Political Science, and is the founder of the nonprofit platform, The Ethics Incubator. Drawing on 2 decades as an ethics advisor, guiding corporations, academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, and her own students, Susan's work shows how ethics can be used to create a sea change of positive decisions that ripple outward to our personal and professional lives, as well as the wider world, offering unprecedented opportunity for good. Susan is joined tonight in conversation with CNBC's Sameepa Shetty, producer for Squawk on the Street and Squawk Alley. Before I hand things over to Sameepa, a few housekeeping items. We are recording tonight's event and we'll post a link to the recording on Battery TV, our YouTube channel, following tonight's event and share it with everyone who RSVP'd. I'll drop a link to that as well in the chat. Please feel free to use the chat to interact with us and each other. We will have a Q&A towards the end of the hour, so please use the Q&A feature just below to drop your questions in for Susan and Sameepa. And now, Sameepa, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Colleen. Well, this is going to be interesting. Colleen, thanks for the very, very kind introduction. I'm just waiting for Susan to pop back on my screen. I wonder if we can all see Susan. Oh, yeah. What a great moment in time. Here we are sitting on the eve of the inauguration. Tomorrow, we have a new president who takes over and takes power at the Capitol back. But that does not mean that we can all just collectively forget about what has happened over the last 4 years. And I think all of the events that culminated to the riots at the Capitol, January 6th, they all cast a pall over what we are witnessing today and what we think of our democracy, what we think of our nation. So I think it's the perfect time to have this conversation with Susan Liautaud and discuss ethics, because we have a president whose motto is to restore the moral and to restore the ethics of our nation together. But he cannot do it alone. We need to all be in this together and integrate the way we think about ethics in our day-to-day lives. So when I opened up this book, which was first sent to me, I picked it up with a lot of skepticism. I wondered, like, who is this? And why am I reading about a structured way of thinking about ethics? And that, put me down into a completely different area where I had to learn and know more about Susan and what her thoughts and ideas were. So Susan, before we dive into the book and what made you write this and what you put in it, tell us how you got here. Give us a little bit of a background of who you are, how you got to Stanford, also what made you write this book.
Thank you, Sameepa. And let me also say thank you to the Battery and thank you to all of you for joining. And before I start to answer your question in earnest, I also want to say that on the eve of the inauguration, so many people are suffering in so many ways from COVID. And I just want to say that my heart goes out to everybody who has suffered loss and suffering all of the various consequences of COVID. And indeed, we can talk about the ethics of that as well if you're interested this evening. So I started out my career as a lawyer and I saw many complex problems, but I was starting to see very early on that the law wasn't really enough, that more and more the world was getting out ahead of us. And we saw things like the collapse of Enron and a number of other stories in the news. And I realized that my passion is actually for stories. And I was starting to see stories around me everywhere. Technology was coming on, and a friend of mine had a son who was suffering from a very severe social media addiction. And stories were happening in the news that seemed to be getting away from us. There were stories, of course, that we felt, why are they repeating over and over again, like the abhorrent racism among certain police situations. And I started to then think about what is driving all of this. And I had to move back to the US at the time. When I was a lawyer, I was living in Paris. I had to move back to the US, and I started teaching at Stanford. And the first year I offered to my students, instead of an exam, a chance to decipher and explain and try to solve an ethical dilemma that had not yet been solved. And of the 55 or so students, I got back 53 different stories. And the same thing has happened every year since then, which tells me that there are so many different things, from gene editing to how Uber is treating its drivers, to personal stories, again, to things like racism that seem like age-old problems. And I thought, let me step back and think about, what do all these stories have in common? Because we don't have separate ethics for each type of story. So there were three things that emerged. The first is that the law was clearly not keeping up with the reality that we were living in, particularly as technology accelerated. So we all grew up thinking the law was to prevent harm and to guide our decision-making. It wasn't holding up its end of the bargain. And so there was a lot of space between the law and reality. And that's that space that I call the edge in the book. And in
Right.
between the two is where ethics needs to step up and help us make good decisions. The second point in common that I found is that, I'm not sure about all of you, but I sometimes watch the news and I think, these are the same stories over and over again. We never learn our lessons. And I tried to understand what was driving that. Why were the same stories repeating? And they would end in sort of mea culpas, or fire the CEO, or bring tech executives to Washington, but we never actually seemed to get a full ethics reset. And then the third was that more and more, the expertise around very complicated parts of our reality, like artificial intelligence, for example, were being lodged in the brains of a very limited number of experts. And it seemed to me absolutely impossible that those who control technology, those who are able to have that expertise, whether it's in medicine or technology or otherwise, would control the ethics. And putting all those three things together, the book set out to offer some guidance about how can people from all walks of life get a handle on these complicated questions, make more powerful decisions, and back to my stories, drive all of your own best stories and your best impact on other people's stories.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, because at the end of the day, when I read this book, the thing that I was left with is I feel so at a loss sometimes, so overwhelmed with emotion and information, that I feel like, wait, do I have the power in me? Do I have the tools with me to be able to make a decision about whether this action was ethical or not? Do I support it? Do I not? Where do I stand in all of this? Now, you've brought a lot of like technological questions into play. There's CRISPR, there's robots. Someone like me, a layperson sitting at home, might think, well, I'm not a robotics engineer. How do I know whether having a robot in your life is ethical or not? So I found this book that you've written very useful and empowering to me myself, that, wait, hang on. I don't need all the information in the world. I don't need to be a mechanical engineer to be able to make my decisions. I actually have a few guiding principles here. Susan, talk to me about the 6 frameworks, or the 6 things that you came up with that all of us can probably think about as we go about our daily lives and live our, make decisions on a day-to-day basis. What are the 6 things?
So in the book, I talk about 6 forces, and what these 6 forces are having done years of advising and studying and research, I've identified these 6 forces that I believe are present in virtually any ethical dilemma we face, personal or professional or societal, to varying degrees. And what happens is, it's a little bit like when you hear an unusual name, all of a sudden you start to see it everywhere. You see it on the side of a bus, you see it on a salesperson's
mind off.
tag. Yeah, exactly. So these six forces, once you've understood them, they're just become part of the lens through which you see the world. So you don't have to work at it. So the first of the six forces I call banish the binary. We're in an epidemic of binary thinking. We have Brexit in Europe, in or out of the UK, of the European Union. We have yes or no, do it or don't do it, right or wrong. We even have labels like ethical and unethical. Well, nobody's ethical or unethical all of the time. I'm certainly not perfect. Nobody's perfectly ethical, and nobody, I think, should be sort of condemned forever. So the question
I have to tell you, by the way, Susan, that's the aha moment in the book. Like, Paige, I was all skeptical about this book and what it was going to give to me until I got to page 12. And you literally, I find this explanation fascinating, where you say that labeling things as ethical or unethical is in fact not ethical decision making. And I think this is where you went into detail about, and I questioned my own beliefs, and I questioned the way I was making my own decisions. Yes, a lot of what I was doing was, well, I don't support what this company is doing, so I'm not going to buy their product. It was a very binary way of thinking, but then you made me reset my brain and change the framework and ask myself different questions.
So the problem with labels, and we like labels, right? Because they're easy. It's easier to just decide this is good and this is bad. The problem is that it deprives us of opportunity and it leaves risks unmanaged. So my view of ethics is very practical. It's about problem solving. It's about seizing opportunity, and it's about identifying risks. And in the world we live in, both opportunities and risk change over time. And these labels we put on people and on decisions are static. So, and the other thing is they can be terribly unhelpful, and they elicit yes, no responses. So for example, we might not want to say, you know, if we ask about gene editing, we might say wonderful in the context of careful use by, you know, medical advisors to cure cancer, but not so wonderful if we see what just happened in China when rogue scientist Hu Jiankui tried to edit the embryos of human genomes against all sort of international norms. So it's a question, I like to replace the question ethical versus unethical with the question when and under what circumstances would I do something? And that's true irrespective of the question. But there is one exception. I do want to say that some things are binary, meaning straight up unacceptable. And the kinds of things I would put in that category are racism, sexual misconduct, or an example I use in the book where the former Boeing CEO, Dennis Muhlenberg, asked President Trump to keep flying planes after 2 deadly crashes within months of each other that he couldn't explain. So there are cases where straight up binary is important.
Right. We'll get to the others as well. But before we do that, there is this point that you make also in the book that we cannot stand or tolerate the monopolization of ethics, because that will actually cause more danger in and of itself. Talk to me. What do you mean about that? Like, what do you mean by monopolizing ethics?
So that's a great question, Samipa. What we're seeing is a lot of talk, for example, about the big tech behemoths, the so-called FANGs, for example, and how they're monopolizing search or they're monopolizing social media. And there's been a lot of news lately about antitrust response and the like. My concern is something quite different, which is to say, we need to be concerned about who is making the decisions about things that have a huge impact on society. So it's not so much about search or about social media. It's about how do we democratize ethics? That is the mission of the book, and that is the mission of my work, which is to engage the views and the participation of everyone, of people from all walks of life, when we're thinking about questions like, should a social media company shut down the account of the President of the United States? Or when we're thinking about questions like, what is the right use of targeted advertising in various technology companies? So as I said earlier, what's happening is that just by the fact that these companies control the technology, and just by the fact that they have the expertise, they're the ones who understand how the algorithms work, for example, they are de facto controlling the ethics. They are making the decisions. And that's not right. We need to be asking who gets to decide. And even if there are some deciders that have this kind of power, at the very least, we need to say they have a responsibility to engage and embrace the public's view on these questions.
Let's stick with that example of technology and the power that they have today. I heard Tristan Harris say that free is the most expensive business model there is, right? So how should companies, I'm going to ask you a question as it relates to anyone who is an entrepreneur, a manager, a leader in a company that may be listening to you, all of those tech companies whose business model is offering a free product, how should they be thinking about ethics and incorporating ethical decision making in their business? Because there is an inherent push and pull when your entire business model is based on attention and making your product, well, some would argue, addictive. So how do people in these positions think about ethical decision making and not monopolizing it, yet doing the right thing?
Well, you're absolutely right that these business models are based on eyeballs on screens for a maximum amount of time. But let me start by saying the ethical questions that show up in technology are not dependent on size. So for anybody who's a venture capitalist or anybody who is starting a company, from the very, very start, very initial conceptualization of a product or the very start of a company with the first employee, the learning in the book is applicable and can help companies grow and develop without coming into some of the kinds of problems that you've described. But basically, to answer your question specifically, nothing is free. And what has happened is that in particular in the US, there's a combination of some people understandably don't really understand what they're giving up when they use something for free. Other people may or may not care. So if you contrast, for example, in Europe and in particular in France, you know, I interviewed a very, very senior person who was involved in the G7 looking at data privacy. And she said, in France, you can no more sell your data than you can sell an organ. So there's a very different conceptualization of data privacy. But the responsibility of the companies, if they're going to keep these free models, is to make sure we understand what that means. Because it isn't free. What are we giving up? And to make sure that we understand it in plain language, in 3 or 4 sentences, and not in 20 micro print pages of terms of service, all of which culminate in a disclaimer at the end that company X is only liable to you for a maximum of $100 or so, whatever happens. So they owe us at the very least transparency. What I'm arguing for here is a little bit like the technology version of smoking kills on a cigarette package. Just tell us what we're really paying in language we can understand so we can make better choices.
Technology is addictive, stay away, it can cause cancer, things of that nature. What's it going to take, Susan? Because honest to goodness, it took me jumping through at least 5 hoops to get your book cover on my Amazon Fire TV. I had to first give up the rights to all of my photos on my phone to the Amazon Photos app so that it could cull through everything and allow me to do this. And I think you also mentioned this in the book, that Jack Dorsey himself in one of these Senate congressional hearings, I think he said that, I don't think that if you sat with a cup of coffee and read through all of the terms and conditions in our agreement that we signed with our customers, that people will actually understand what we're saying. It's
no,
not,
that's right.
it's not
Jack Dorsey was very upfront. He said, I'm not sure his exact words, but it was something along the lines of, it wouldn't be enjoyable and you wouldn't really understand it. And it's not that, there aren't good people in these companies. People don't go to work in these companies thinking that they want to create ethical problems. But to be honest, Samipa, we know that these problems exist now. So there can be ethical problems where we just couldn't see it coming. But this is not one. We are squarely within it. As you say, people like Tristan have been talking about it for a long time. I've been working on these issues for years and years. And we know these problems exist, and yet we don't seem to make much progress. It's a little bit, frankly, like the COVID, the PPE shortage we had at the beginning.
Yeah.
The fact that a pandemic could occur was no surprise. It was a knowable, in fact, it was a known risk, and yet we didn't prepare for it. Now we're even beyond that. Now we know we're squarely in the risk. We've seen the damage. We've seen, as you point out, the mental health issues. We've seen the data privacy issues. So we're beyond the time where it's time to try to do this, or at least to try to give people back their choices, meaning tell them what they're actually opting in for.
Right. So the implication here is that anyone who's listening to us right now, be it a CEO, a founder, an entrepreneur, someone who's building technology, thinking about technology, you cannot just get away by saying, well, I didn't build it for harm. I didn't mean any harm, because that is a very binary way of thinking about what you're doing, right? I think the whole point of what you're trying to say here is expand the horizon. Look at the impact it can have on stakeholders. Look at different scenarios under which what you might have created as something useful might actually turn out to be harmful. So we cannot just walk away. All of us have that responsibility, right?
No, that's right. And I think when I talk about thinking about the consequences of our decisions, I always emphasize the word potential. So the actual consequences that you know will happen, the potential consequences that could happen. So, we're responsible for thinking much longer. And with technology, we're also thinking about the potential impact even on future generations. Colleen mentioned that wonderfully, climate change is the charitable priority right now for
Sparked, yes.
But climate change is a perfect example of our behavior today will affect future generations. But gene editing is another. Editing genes, manipulating the human germline will affect people in future generations. So our notion of the possible consequences of our actions, we need to take a broader view of that. That can mean touching people across the world in ways that we never could before. And it can even mean touching people in subsequent generations.
This is a good reminder for everyone who's listening to us right now that the Q&A button is right there, because in about 15 to 20 minutes from now, your questions are going to be taken by Susan. So use the Q&A button to put your questions, because that's where we'll start first and not the chat, just in case you were doing that. I want to bring up a different point right now, that all of this sounds great, but none of this ethical decision making can actually work in a society which has a trust deficit, not only between individuals, but between individuals and corporations. And I think one of the things that you brought up in the book was these three key pillars, rather, of how this system functions. It only functions when there is transparency, informed consent, and effective listening. And I really had to sit with that for a couple of minutes to understand the true importance of all these three things. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure. So I mentioned banish the binary. So a second force is what I call crumbling pillars, where we have certain traditions in society that have become the pillars of ethical decision making. We send our children to summer camp, or we have our tonsils removed and we sign informed consent. And by and large, we're pretty happy that somebody has told us what's going to happen and we more or less understand. And again, we don't need to know how to perform a tonsillectomy to know that we're pretty happy that we understand the risks and opportunities. Similarly, transparency. It should mean making sure that the recipient understands it, not that somebody has dumped information on you. So again, not 18 microprint pages of a terms of service, but actually delivering in plain language the information that really matters to us and that helps us understand what choices we have. So very few words, very big print, and what is the impact on my life of using this? Not everything you could possibly tell me or every disclaimer you can possibly think of. And then the third is listening. And one of the things, and I put my hand up first, I think we all need to think about listening. And where I'm particularly struck, including in recent weeks with politics, is we listen to what we want to hear. Right. We listen to what we expect to hear. We listen to what we think somebody else should be feeling, but we don't necessarily listen to what people are really telling us. And I think that's something that we can all be better at, is to step back and say, so an example is that I hear from medical ethicist experts that young doctors very often jump to a diagnosis. They're not really listening to what the patient says because they expect that the diagnosis will be X if they see certain things. But that's the same throughout society. But to your point about trust, the foundation of trust is truth, which is a third force that I see in all of our ethical decision making. And so these three pillars hinge on truth. And in fact, ethical decision making in general hinges on truth. And we can talk more about that either with you or in the Q&A. But when we talk about healing, whether it's from COVID, whether it's from the political dysfunctionality that we're experiencing, the starting point has to be truth. And that is always, for me, the starting point in any ethical decision making.
Great point, because I damn near fell off my chair when I was reading the book that in 2017, when you heard a certain someone on the television speak about alternative facts, you immediately called up someone at Stanford University and were like, all right, I'm going to be teaching a new course. It is
That's
the
right.
ethics of truth in a post-truth world. So I think this is a very important piece of the puzzle. How are you able to make ethical decisions, or how can society as a whole go forward when we're living in this world of compromised truths and technology, which is becoming an enabler of compromised truths? And this is one of the pillars or one of the frameworks that you have mentioned in the book as required or a requisite for ethical decision making. How do we break that?
So I think one of the, what I call compromised truth in the book is the greatest global systemic risk of our time. And I believe that because it really infiltrates all of the other risks, including climate change, including this technological monopolization or data privacy, including financial system meltdown. So one of the things that we need to do as individuals, as institutions, as a society is recommit to truth. And that's sort of no easy feat, but that's absolutely critical. And there is no such thing, you mentioned alternative facts. It's very true. To be honest, I was at the gym. I was on the elliptical and I was watching the news, and I should have been more athletic, but instead I was focused on the news, and I heard this term alternative facts, and I literally almost fell off the elliptical. And in fact, I stepped off of it. I wrote to the person who heads public policy at Stanford, and I said, I would like to teach a new class called Ethics of Truth in a Post-Truth World. And a couple of months later, the course started. That was January. The course started in April. And on the day the course started, students all over campus were wearing these pink rubber bracelets that said, "Truth matters." Now, just think about that for a minute. When in history before did we call into question whether or not truth matters? Right.
Or what truth is.
Or what truth is. When in history did we have a phrase like post-truth become the word of the year for a famous dictionary, right? So what I tell my students is that we can do ethics without truth all we want. We can cherry pick the convenient truths. We can curate ourselves on social media and leave out the part of the truth we don't want to face. We can tolerate straight up lies from leaders. But no matter what, the truth will come back to bite. Ethics functions in reality, and stepping outside of truth means doing our ethics outside of reality. And no matter what, reality always comes back to bite.
And I know a lot of people must be thinking, oh, well, but I had a different experience. And well, truth is subjective. And I love this line. And you've picked this out, that a fact-based approach to truth does not preclude how a difference of opinion, emotion, and personal bias can lead to different experiences of reality. I mean, what the temperature is right now is a fact. It's a truth. But our experiences might be different, right?
Right. One of my students put it very well in class. He said, if it's 60 degrees out, that is a fact. Now, you may be cold at 60 degrees. I may be warm at 60 degrees. You may have an opinion about the implication of that for some other matter. But you strike a very, very important point here, Samipa, which is facts matter, and opinions matter. They just don't happen to be the same thing. And where we get into trouble is when we start treating opinion like fact. And by the way, at the extreme, that's where we see authoritarian governments sort of monopolizing the narrative, and sort of their vision of the world is presented as fact. So it's extremely, extremely dangerous to confuse the two.
I mean, this is absolutely critical, and keep those questions coming in the Q&A box. Remember, not in the chat box, because we're going to get to them right after this. Again, another brilliant line from your book: subjective wishful thinking should not be normalized as an acceptable substitute for factual truth. So I'm going to ask you a few like Q&A day-to-day ethical dilemmas that all of us face, right? I'm on a dating app. Can I or can I not lie about my age? Or should I not?
So, well, first of all, you can lie about your age, but at the end, like I said, reality comes out. Now, there's, I studied Chinese, and I'm a very humble student of this very beautiful and extremely difficult language. But one of the things I saw in one of my lessons was a practice whereby or in history, whereby in the middle of the afternoon, in broad daylight, single people would go out in a park and just mingle among the trees. And it wasn't really sort of overtly looking for a companion, but everybody knew that everybody there was single. And I emphasize in a park, meaning in person and broad daylight. So nobody had beautiful evening lighting, and certainly nobody had the ability to present a different self via a dating app. So let's think about that. It's not maybe incredibly harmful, but at the end of the day, if you're actually going to have a relationship based on trust, somebody's going to know your age. But if you broaden the question a little bit, I give an example in the book of a 69-year-old Dutch man who actually tried to petition a court to change his age legally. He said that he felt that he was 49, or he quote unquote identified as 49. Now, thankfully, the court declined. And at first, this might seem like a story of whimsy or just humor. But in fact, think about how we use age, chronology in society, driver's licenses, how we give certain medical treatments, even, for example, the COVID vaccine, where we're saying 16 and below, we don't have the research yet. All kinds of privileges in society, voting, depend on accurate age. And I can feel anything I want. But if I say I feel 30, in addition to the fact that my 29-year-old son would likely have difficulty with that, it's not factually accurate, right? So I think it's a slippery slope. And on the one hand, there's sort of embellishing a social media platform, a social media posting, which is just sort of harmless. And on the other hand, there's delivery of information on the basis of which we're voting and electing our leaders that is false.
All right. So the next question is, I'm just asking on behalf of a friend. Is it okay and ethical, Susan, you think, to like rip off your friend's Netflix account? Where do we fall in the whole ethical spectrum on that one?
Okay, so where we fall on the ethical spectrum, first of all, Netflix does have terms of service. The company is quite clear, and I'll just say that this is an example of a situation where I make a quick decision. The company tells me they don't sell my data. I know I'm not sending them my DNA, so I confess to sort of clicking I agree without reading the terms of service. But Netflix does say something along the lines of, I believe when I last read it, when it's been a little while, but you can share with your household. So how do you interpret your household? Does that mean blood relatives? Does that mean a household that if my children live in the States, my 4 older children, does that mean we can still all share, but we don't live in the same place? I don't think what Netflix means is that you can share with your 25 closest friends. So, will the company come after you? So there is a bit of a legal issue here, but will the company come after you? I don't, most likely they have, bigger problems. But on the other hand, I think there's a balance.
Right. I think my point in bringing up all of these, almost day-to-day ethical dilemmas is the aha moments that I had while reading the book. There were so many things, and I was telling my friend this the other day that I'm so sorry, but I've been behaving in an unethical manner with you for the last couple of years, because I had never explicitly given a disclaimer to anyone who walked into my house that, hey, I have Alexa going, or hey, I have Google going, and I have these smart assistants. So just so you know, our conversation may be recorded. Are you okay with it? And I think that becomes an important factor of transparency and informed consent when we discuss ethical decision making, but on a very personal level, on a very human level. This is not just something that institutions need to do, follow, and governments and politicians, but it's you and I.
No, that's right. And it's sometimes this technology is so ubiquitous, and it feels so much, just as you say, Sameepa, it feels sort of part of our house or part of our daily life, or I'm wearing
Right.
a watch that can record all kinds of things. Most of us wouldn't dream of putting a tape recorder on in our living room when we have friends for dinner without telling them. And in fact, in
Right.
many states, that would be illegal. But yeah, we don't really think twice about the fact that Amazon, Alexa, and it's not just Amazon Alexa, it's any of these types of products, they record. Yeah. And we don't think about the fact that that might be a question of respect for our friends. And it's not that anybody's a bad person. And it's not that we have to just be constantly belaboring every decision. But yes, it's true that we were living in a different world where we need to think about some of this very invasive technology, that we may choose, others may not choose to engage with it in the same way.
I think this brings me to an important point of behavior and how all of this factors in to ethical decision making, not just in the world around us, but in our daily lives. In the book, you mentioned one thing, that when people view something as low risk, they act with impunity. So, what other sort of low risk behavior have you encountered which could pose significant ethical risks? And then this leads me on to the question of leadership, because what you portray and what you set out as the culture of an organization, a nation, anything, is something that people then follow, pick up.
So what you've hit on here is a fourth of the six forces, and that is the contagion, what I call the contagion of unethical behavior. And we can talk about how positive behavior is contagious, it can be contagious as well. But there are a number of drivers of contagion of unethical behavior. And this is what explains what I said early on, the repetition of the same stories over and over again, or the beginning of a story that seems to just grow in scope and in seriousness. So one of the reasons we see the spread of unethical behavior is that we're so focused on eradicating the wrongdoing. So sort of the mislabeling opioids or the data privacy violation, that we leave in place what I call the drivers of the spreading. And some of the drivers of the spreading can be sort of age-old classics like pressure or greed, or as you say, impunity. Nobody's, people won't get caught. So, and others can be techie. So you can have drivers of spreading, like social media will spread disinformation. But what happens is when impunity sets in, when people don't feel that they could get caught, or if they get caught, the consequences will be very great. They just assume something is low risk and they just keep at it. People do a risk reward calculation, and if they think there's enough benefit, they'll just keep at it. And that might be a company that says, yes, everybody's complaining about our data privacy violations, but at the end of the day, we still have more than 2 billion users. And it might be somebody in a company that has gotten away with some behavior like expense account behavior or really seemingly minor things. But one of the reasons that impunity is so dangerous is that it resets the risk reward calculation. More people will be willing to continue bad behavior. More people will be.
It normalizes bad behavior, right? Like it's okay. If a leader is name calling other people, then suddenly name calling becomes okay. Then does that mean that you start teaching that to your children and you allow your children to name call other people as well?
Exactly right. Yeah. And the contagion. So when contagion, what does that mean? It means we, just like the spread of a disease, we see more and more of the unethical behavior. The more you see it, the more you start to say, well, it's okay for them. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe I can do it. Yeah.
And that's a slippery slope. It's never gotten better than that. And I think another point that has to be mentioned, because we've talked about these technologies operating at the edge, be it CRISPR, robotics, there's so much that is happening that our minds have not even thought of, but it's very much in practice and in existence right now. I think I have to ask you about the risks of disintermediation, right? Forget the far-flung technologies. There are more day-to-day touch points that we use, like, for instance, Uber or an Airbnb, where the quote-unquote middleman has been cut out from the equation, right? Mm-hmm. Like technology is an enabler for a great many things. But this disintermediation also brings with it risks, ethical risks. And then it leaves the question wide open. What happens? Whose responsibility is it when things go south?
No, absolutely. Disintermediation is really key. I should say, Samipa, that I am very pro societally beneficial technology and pro innovation when ethically deployed. So I don't in any way want to suggest that I'm not. And in fact, when I talked earlier about seizing opportunities and mitigating risks, we have a responsibility to seize opportunities to make things available to many, many people who otherwise wouldn't be able to access certain things. So I am very pro technology. Now, where we're seeing this, you mentioned Uber. All of a sudden, Uber is sort of direct. We don't have taxi dispatches anymore. Airbnb is a really clear example. Airbnb, makes available all kinds of experiences and all kinds of prices of short-term hotel accommodations or equivalent, but we don't have a front desk. So if we take a situation like hotels in the US, since the Civil Rights Act, we cannot racially discriminate in a hotel. Hotels cannot tell you, sorry, we don't take you, or sorry, it's twice as expensive, or sorry, you need to give us a different kind of ID. But early in Airbnb, and I want to say at the outset, the company's done a terrific job of grasping this and trying to correct it. But early in Airbnb, we didn't have the intermediaries, and Airbnb was this blended model, not quite hotel, not quite private home. And what we saw, one of the risks we saw, was an age-old ethics drama, a terrible, terrible ethics problem, one of the worst our country and the world faces, which is that we saw racism between hosts and potential guests. Very blatant examples. There have been studies done that demonstrated that. The company just, honestly, they quite straight up said, we just didn't see that, we didn't think of it. Once it was pointed out to them, they took a number of measures and are still working on taking a number of measures to eradicate that. But that's one example of disintermediation. Another important one is millions of people using 23andMe and Ancestry.com. If we go to a doctor and the doctor says, I think it would be a good idea for you to do a genetics test, odds are you're going to get a test on one specific thing or a few that the doctor thinks are important for you. And the doctor is going to be supervising the process and the interpretation of the results. 23andMe disintermediates, takes the medical experts out of it. So in addition to sort of you directly with your results, there isn't much filtering of, you only want to know X. And all of a sudden, we're faced with knowing things that are unknowable that could be potentially incredibly important. So you're absolutely right. We need to think about both what's happening and the impact on us, but also who's responsible.
I'm going to turn the spotlight over to everyone who is participating and joining us. Thank you so very much for being here, and continue to keep those questions coming in on the Q&A tab, because now it's time for Q&A. Susan, the first question that I have, it's a very interesting one from Letty, who wants to know, who can we point to that is doing well? Apparently, she wants to know, as an example, I think she says, the inventors of CRISPR have been talking about the ethical risks and dilemmas from day one, and yet misdeeds happened anyway. So perhaps I think the question here is that she wants to know which companies might be tackling ethics correctly and can be pointed to as setting the example, so to speak.
So Letty, this is a terrific question. And I want to say, to take advantage of your question, to say one of the points of the book is to show that this is all very hopeful. You're absolutely right. The early CRISPR team, Emmanuel Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna in particular, Jennifer Doudna, were very, very out there. A wonderful article in Science magazine warning everybody that we needed to engage the voices of ethicists and a broader group of stakeholders on these questions. But nobody can ever prevent all intentional wrongdoing, whether it's criminal activity in a company or whether it's in the case of CRISPR, the rogue scientist I mentioned earlier, He Jiankui in China, manipulating the embryos of twin girls. The problem today is that and this brings up another force that I mentioned in the book, power is so scattered that it's harder and harder to find the intentional wrongdoers, to locate them, even if we know something has happened. And it's harder and harder to prevent it. Another example of this is, terrorism on the internet. But you're right, there are a number of people doing it right. You mentioned one, a couple of others I'll mention. Microsoft decided that they would not sell facial recognition technology to police forces until we could get the ethics of that, and in particular racial bias, straightened out. That's another great example. And another totally different example in a different area, because the book the book covers all areas, is Malala Yousafzai, the youngest Nobel laureate in history, has mobilized support for girls' education around the globe against all odds. So there's a lot of good. And when I mentioned the contagion of unethical behavior, we can deploy these same forces I mentioned in service of driving positive behavior. So thank you so much for that question.
As a quick, on the other hand, Susan, I want to follow up here. Technology is always changing. We're always getting better information. We're always getting better in terms of AI, artificial intelligence, recognition, software. As we get more data, we get better. So why should we prevent? Why should we take this stance right now and curtail the advancements in technology? Why should we do that?
So to come back to the question that I mentioned, when and under what circumstances, we're constantly balancing opportunities and risk. And at the moment, one of the things we can say is, look, facial recognition technology can be so incredibly important if we want to identify a terrorist in a crowd, or we want to identify a lost child. So maybe for those uses, we will use them, but we won't just allow any person on the street to be caught by facial recognition technology when we have no idea where that data is going to end up, who might use it and for what purpose, where it might get transferred to. So it's a constant adjustment. And your point is really important, that we're monitoring these ethical dilemmas over time. And that's indeed the reason why we don't just stick a label on facial rec technology and say ethical or unethical. We say when and under what circumstances.
All right, I have a fascinating question from Susan O'Connell. She says, I'm a Zen teacher, and there is a process for individuals to study ethical parameters, which are guidelines, not commandments, and stand up in public in a ceremony to declare that how we want to live and what our ethical guidelines are. What do you think about making these kinds of publicly accountable commitments?
Well, Susan, I think you'll see in my in the first chapter of my book, I talk about everyone choosing their own principles. I would never dream of choosing somebody else's principles, and I describe principles very much as you do, as guidelines. They guide our decision making. They're not rules like 25 miles an hour or no smoking. And I think the idea of accountability is really very interesting. I think we all need to be accountable to ourselves. Now, there are varying situations where people need to be accountable in public. Certainly our public figures, and public figures don't just mean politicians, but people in positions of responsibility. They may be religious leaders, they may be corporate leaders. And I do think that accountability comes out in a number of different ways. One way is the very interesting way you point out, that sounds incredibly healing, I should say as well, of standing up in a group that you trust. But I think people should be able to find their own ways to accountability. And sometimes that's public and sometimes that's not.
Hey, in fact, I forget that I failed to ask you this question. How do you define ethics? Give me something simple.
So I define ethics in very practical terms. To just continue with this question, I define ethics as figuring out what our principles are, who we want to be for the world, how we define our identity, and taking into consideration in our decision making the impact we have on others. So who are the stakeholders who are going to be affected by our decision? What are the consequences we're creating? And taking responsibility for our actions.
I almost feel like you're saying it's principles in action. All right, we have another question from Dion. Great one. How do we know when we are operating as rational versus rationalizing?
Very interesting question. So if I understand the question correctly, rationalizing, and please correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, rationalizing in the sense of making excuses. There are all kinds of times where we see excuses for things. And I'll just take this question as a bit of a launching pad for what happens when we go off the rails. So sometimes we actually act rationally in the moment, or what we believe is acting rationally. But all of us, my hand up first, we make mistakes. Things don't work out, even with our best judgment, things don't work out as we had hoped. So how do you get back on the rails? Well, one thing is you start with truth. Just like there's no ethical decision making without truth, there's no recovery from an ethical error without truth. And excuses may or may not be connected to the truth. So rationalizing may or may not be connected to the truth. So, but we start with truth, and then we move forward to accountability, to the earlier question, and to a plan.
I think Susan, I'm going to quickly interject because Dion, I'm going to repeat Q&A, please, because I don't monitor chats, but she did mention what she meant was sometimes we make a decision and then justify it versus making perhaps like a well thought out rational decision. So that's where she's coming from. So.
Okay, thank you, Dion, for the clarification. So it's true that a lot of times we want something to happen. So we make that decision and we justify it because that's the outcome we want, instead of starting with, okay, what are my principles? what are going to be the consequences of this decision over time and on other people? In other words, what story am I going to be driving with this decision? And that's just human nature, but you're absolutely right to call us out on this, to call everyone out on it. Ethical decision-making is a process of thinking about the impact our decisions are going to have. It's not about figuring out what we would like to happen and figuring out if we can come up with a compelling explanation for it.
Has there been an ethical quandary that you've been stumped by?
Oh, I'm stumped by all kinds of things. I don't, I'm stumped by all of the things we face today. What I'm not so stumped by are the kinds of examples that I gave earlier, where we know what the problem is and we know what the solution is. We know that wearing masks helps prevent COVID. We knew that there was a pandemic that was possible, and we were not prepared with the PPE. To me, and I say this on behalf of all of the first responders, frontline workers, everybody who was put at risk by that failure, that's a completely understandable, unacceptable position for us to be in. So, but yes, I'm stumped by all kinds of things, including the day-to-day things in my own life.
Dion, thank you for the question. Scott has one, Susan. He asks, what can we do to address, or how do we resolve issues of journalists not providing truth? Rather, they offer opinion or spins in place of truth. It seems that we have very few reliable, trustworthy public sources of truth amid a world of online opinion and spin, which is not grounded in reality.
First of all, let me just say that this is a wonderful question, especially at this time where free speech has been so much at stake in the past few weeks. My experience with responsible journalists is that they have codes of ethics. For example, even in my post-truth class, I look at the New York Times Code of Ethics or the Washington Post Code of Ethics. Responsible journalists operate by codes of ethics. They're very careful to distinguish fact and opinion. And present people, whether it's on air or whether it's on paper or online, and really do distinguish the fact and opinion. What's happening now is that there are so many different forums that are calling themselves journalists, that there's sort of a blurred boundary that almost anybody can consider themselves a journalist. And that's, I'm sorry to say, just not the case. And so that's where, like you, Scott, I get very frustrated. I see, to use your word, spin. I get very frustrated that the publications that are providing the forum for this wonderful free speech, I'm not trying to quash free speech in any way, are not being more exacting about what is opinion and what is fact. And then finally, I would say that, there's a lot of fact checking that goes on in responsible journalistic outlets. Like anyone else, they can make mistakes. But my personal experience is that the responsible journalists correct their mistakes. And we see corrections in print all the time. We see occasionally corrections on the air.
As a follow-up to this, how do we break information silos that people seem to be caught up in, right? Because if you're only exposed to a certain kind of news or media source, then you probably are not being exposed to ideas or thoughts which question your beliefs. So if you are operating in an information silo, like many of us are, how do we develop that framework in which you're able to make ethical choices, which means basically racism bad, don't indulge in it?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that we are all algorithmically put in bubbles, whether we think we are or not. Anybody on social media, anybody, even using search functions, we are algorithmically put in bubbles. We all know that this is the case. And so we need to fight it. We need to, proactively, I often say ethics are proactive. It's not, there's no such thing as neutral, just like Ibram X. Kendi says about racism, there's no such thing as neutral. So we need to proactively go out and seek voices that are not like ours. We need to go to news outlets that are known to be sort of from a different political perspective. We need to seek out friends. We need to seek out other sources and mix and match. And I try really hard never to look only at the same news sources, but it's not easy in this particular, it's very easy to find ourselves, particularly when we're doing things electronically, to find ourselves electronically trapped in bubbles. We just need to be aware that that's what's happening.
It's really not, especially as more and more technology develops around us and pushes us to the edge where there are no clear boundaries. There is no law. There is no legal guideline on how we should think, act, or behave. I think these murkier questions just will keep getting murkier. I think we're going to close on this very final question. I think it's the perfect one as well. Susan, what is the opposite of cancel culture? Is it hashtag can learn or hashtag can change or something else? How do we basically almost, it feels like, how do we collectively rise above and give people second chances or take a moment to accept new information and make different decisions or different choices?
So I can't really answer the opposite because that's falling back into the binary. It's this or it's that. So I'm going to step out of the binary and I'm going to say that the question about cancel culture is increasingly important. And I'm really glad that this was raised. We need to be willing to give people a second chance. We need to be willing to say, I've said really stupid things in my life, and I need to be able to listen to other people tell me, oh my gosh, you couldn't possibly have meant that, and here's why. And I need to be able to say, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant, and rephrase. So one thing is we need to be willing to give people second chances, and even more in a world where there's just so much happening so fast. We're texting so much, we're posting so much, we're all going to make more and more mistakes. I mean, we've all been in that terrible situation where we've sent the email to the wrong person, no matter how careful we think we are, right? But the other is we must, to come back to the core point of truth, free speech is absolutely critical to a society that is committed to truth. And free speech can be very uncomfortable. It can be offensive. Now, that doesn't mean we tolerate violence. That doesn't mean we tolerate hate speech. That doesn't mean we should be encouraging racism. And it certainly doesn't mean we shouldn't be calling out speech that we find, utterly unacceptable, again, like racism or a sexually inappropriate speech. But it does mean that, all cancel or all accept, those are not going to be solutions.
Again, going back to putting the onus on us and not making everything a binary decision or a binary choice. The book, again, is The Power of Ethics, How to Make Good Choices in a Complicated World. I walked into this book with a lot of skepticism, but walked out enlightened and so much empowered to actually make decisions that I think I can live with for the rest of my life. Susan, thank you so much for your indulgence and for your time.
No, thank you so much, Samipa. Thank you so much to the battery. Mostly, thank you so much to all of you who are here this evening. I'm incredibly grateful for your time and honored to be with you.
Likewise. Colleen, over to you.
Thank you all so much. That was fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. I've dropped a link to purchase Susan's book in the chat, so feel free to check it out. We're directing you to bookshop.org, so you can check it out there. And we will keep you posted on more events from Sparked coming up, so be sure to check that out. And in the meantime, everyone take care and have a great evening. Thank you so much.